Great. Okay, so we're having a follow-up meeting after our fourth meeting of the medical marijuana working group with both Rebecca and Chris. And I believe it was additional information from the municipality's perspective around the reclassification of registrations within the program. And I think during the conversation, we kind of lost sight of how it really impacts municipalities. So I wanted to make sure we gave Rebecca and Chris the opportunity to kind of share thoughts, concerns, ideas, whatever they had. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. If you don't mind, I can start.
No, that's fine. I think that's great.
Okay, cool. Well, one of the points that I kind of wanted to make, at least as far as the perspective of municipalities with the classification issue, is that I think that there might be like different purposes for classification that would be important for different people or different perspectives. And I think from the municipality standpoint, the reason why a classification might be helpful or important is more of like a land use regulatory perspective than I think what we were talking about in the work group, which was sort of the threshold for when mandatory testing might be, reasonable. I think a lot of the things that municipalities, at least from my perspective, are dealing with now is trying to figure out exactly what the activity that caregivers are doing is. Like, is it a store? Is it just a home operation? Is there cultivation attached to it? Is it off-site? Is there manufacturing going on? All of those are questions that I think are important for municipalities to know, but I think aren't necessarily very easy to get at this point for them. So I think having something in the registration process that would allow that easier access to that information would be helpful. And it does seem like classification in a caregiver registration identification might work, and it might work within the rulemaking process rather than having to do like a statutory amendment to change the law on how the registration works.
So does it have to do with changing classifications or just being able for towns to understand what's happening so they're able to do their job within their borders as it pertains to registrants within the program itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more the latter, I mean, it's, and maybe not a classification so much as like just like some sort of distinct identification for different types of activity that might be impactful to the municipality's land use
Right.
regulations. Like, I mean, an example would maybe be like manufacturing, right? So a caregiver, by virtue of their state registration, can manufacture, and they can manufacture without using IHS, without the municipalities having any concern about whether or not they've opted into manufacturing facilities, because that type of manufacturing isn't identified as a manufacturing facility that would require municipalities to opt in. But in order for them to understand that they're doing manufacturing that doesn't include IHS, where they wouldn't be concerned about whether or not they've opted into manufacturing facilities, they need to know that. So if there was like some sort of identification in the registration or somewhere to easily access the information that, first of all, they're manufacturing, and second of all, they either are or are not using IHS, then that would be really helpful for municipalities, in my mind.
Yeah, and I think this was kind of brought up by Chris in the second meeting, and I kind of identified it. It seemed like similar concerns, and I think we kind of just glazed over it and went on to another topic, or the meeting wrapped up. But the way Chris was describing it and the work that he does in Portland, it's basically he's able to do his job when registrants voluntarily come forward to the city of Portland. Is that correct, Chris?
Yes, that's correct. And I would agree that I think this wraps, close to what I talked about in that second meeting, where, a lot of on the medical side, a lot of the interaction we've had currently are either what we call a pre-moratorium, or, somebody that was kind of in operation before the city put a moratorium on all services. We've identified those through our database, or B, it's a voluntary, they've come to us, and what do I need to do at the municipal level, to be above board, or C is the violation or the the complaint, the neighbor, or, something has gone wrong there, and, we're getting notified of it. So that's, the general, means in which we find out about them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
I will say, for like an individual, if we're working on any type of investigation, for us to reach back out to your office and receive some information, on an individual or one person, your office has been very easy to work with on that end of things. So but having those connections and all that, all that pre-work needs to go into that first.
Yeah. So from what Rebecca's saying, it would be helpful for towns in order to conduct their business with what they're allowed to do with home rule authority is just be able to proactively have that information at hand, which I think makes a lot of sense. I don't know if it would fall into necessarily the classification conversation or with what we were hoping to get to in the fourth meeting, which we might touch upon in the fifth meeting, which is to discuss this very topic. So, I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
I agree with that. And I think it does, personally, I think it plays into that conversation, on the, and I don't know what you call them, categories or classes, or I do think, and I'll agree with Rebecca, the conversation kind of led towards testing. I was, thinking during the conversation and a lot after that, there's, the way a town has opted into either a dispensary or caregivers is vastly different, in a handful of municipalities. And I do think that presents a logistical challenge when you're talking about that kind of reclass or categories or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I guess I do think also that this does tie into the confidentiality discussion and this authorization of the code enforcement officer to be able to, get information about what conduct is authorized. I think Chris maybe hit on the distinction there too, that, one is, sorry, that's my cat. One is where the code enforcement officer or the municipal officials need to take the initiative to contact the state to get that information. So I guess my sort of line of thinking in trying to work through this idea of a classification or some sort of, separation of different registrations within that registration identification was that information might be at hand when the caregiver could give the code enforcement officer their identification certification for review, or, so that there would be another way to maybe identify information that isn't confidential under statute, instead of having to go through the process of trying to figure it out from the state. Maybe you could get it from the caregiver directly.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I guess it would also mean that the caregiver had to sort of present that information up front. But it was sort of like thinking about through how to do this without requiring some sort of amendment to the statutes, Yeah,
I'd have to think about that. I mean, oh, Chris, go, please. I would rather hear from you.
Sorry, and I apologize for not being on video. I know that makes it challenging. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I was kind of thinking during the discussion, and it goes back to that, just the way some communities have opted into dispensary versus caregiver, is what if that, we had talked a couple times about different classes and how many different classes, and what if caregiver itself was still the designation, but it broke up into, two classes or three classes or whatever it is. You still kept dispensary exactly the way it is now. And I think that would give some definition between, who's growing, your potential home grow, your very smaller operation, and then some of those commercial operations, but it would leave the caregiver designation itself, intact. It would just start to classify within that designation, certain levels or parameters.
Yeah, and I think I did kind of a poor job talking about it when you're thinking about, I mean, you could go two different ways where you can take the classifications of caregivers and split it into two, commercial or non-commercial, whatever it may be. Another way to look at it, with what I think we're trying to achieve with our mission, is scalability, right? Your larger operators have additional regulatory requirements. So it might not even be creating new classes, but if you're engaged in these certain authorized activities, then you would fall into that bucket. Like if you had a
Yep.
storefront, then you're still a caregiver. It's still the same registration class, but if you're actively engaged in that authorized activity, now you're subject to these different sets of requirements. So we've been thinking that through too. So I don't know if that would address some of these concerns. It sounds like we might have to think about it in different ways or creatively, but since you brought it up, I can certainly think about it and possibly bring something back to the two of you, certainly the full group, because I think, I mean, your concerns are certainly valid. So,
Well, I think that definitely addresses the point as well. I think at the end of the day, as long as those parameters, whatever it is, are defined, I think from the municipal enforcement side, that to us is, or to me is huge, is to, this is the field we're playing on for this, operation. And I think that kind of sets everybody up for success, hopefully.
Yeah. And I think if you're talking about what municipalities would want to know, and what would impact how they, respond to caregiver activities, it would be the things I think that municipalities would have the ability to prohibit or to opt into, and that would be storefronts, like you said, and then also IHS manufacturing. I think if there's a caregiver out there that's doing IHS, then they would need to have a manufacturing facility registration, I think. And then also they would need the municipality to have opted in. So if knowing that up front, I think in some sort of classification, as you said, and I think that this is sort of mirroring what you're talking about over there at OMP, just sort of like identifying certain things. But from a municipal perspective, I think those two things would be pretty important to know. And I think be pretty impactful on, the municipality being able to say, okay, this caregiver is doing things that he's allowed to do, and this one is doing things outside of our opt-in, and we should be opting into this, or, they should be not doing this because we haven't opted into it.
right.
The other thing, and I just wanted to make this point too, because I don't think I made it very clearly at the work group. With the wholesaling, I think that the reason that might be an important piece of what caregivers do now for municipalities is that I think that the municipalities that we talk to often get really confused about why there's certain activity that can happen under the under the medical marijuana law, but not under the adult use law. So when there are caregivers that have a big cultivation facility or a grow, in a warehouse, and they're not serving patients, they're just growing for other caregivers, that looks a lot like an adult use cultivation facility to municipalities. And they're like, well, why is that allowed and why is the other one not allowed? But I think, not to say that there should be any sort of combination of those two statutes at all, but I think just to make the point for municipalities, knowing what that is and that it is authorized and that it is a thing that they can do within their registration would be good to know. And I think that an easy way to do that is to identify that this caregiver in their registration is authorized to do wholesale, or they have decided that they're going to do wholesale by this amount. Making that point, I wasn't saying that we should go back to when they can only do a certain percentage of wholesale with their.
I understood that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I understood
that. Knowing that information for municipalities would be important. I think, so, and the other, a caregiver that does entirely wholesale versus a caregiver that serves patients in a storefront those are two different land use impacts too. Like, I think that a code enforcement officer looking at a wholesale caregiver operation might be more concerned about, the land use impacts, like odor control issues, or, the size of the grow and other types of things that they would be included in like a site plan review of like a warehouse or more agricultural kind of activity, versus a caregiver that's serving patients either out of their home or somewhere else or at a storefront. might be more concerned about things like parking issues or traffic on the road, like those kinds of things. So, you know, that information I think would be important for local officials.
Oh, is it just me or am I frozen or is Rebecca
No,
frozen?
I lost her at local offish.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll see if she comes back in a second.
I
Oh.
you know, I do.
Am I back? Can you
Yep,
hear me?
you're back. Yep.
Sorry, where'd you lose me?
Local officials.
What did I say about local? It's easier for local officials. It would be easier for local officials to figure out what box to put them in. You know, like in the local land use ordinances, there's usually a list of permitted uses and what type of permit they would need. So being able to sort of hone in on what the activity is and being able to fit it into that land use chart that most municipalities have would help them sort of figure out what the permit is, where it's allowed, where it's not, and that kind of thing.
Sure.
So I do think that information, just information in general about the activity would be important for municipal officials in any way that can be facilitated through some sort of classification within the caregiver registration would, I think, be helpful.
Even with the break in that, she said it much better than I did. So yes, I agree.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I'm glad that we had this follow-up conversation because obviously the municipalities are an important stakeholder in this process, and that's really what we're trying to do is get this to where it's working for everybody. And I understand that municipalities have their jobs to do, and they need to be able to do it and make it as easy as possible for everybody to coexist. So,
Right.
I don't have any other questions unless Rebecca, you or Chris have anything else they want to add.
I'm all set at this point.
I think I'm good too. But again, thanks for letting us chat about this. I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Yeah, and if we have any follow-up questions, we'll either ping you or bring it up at the next meeting.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
guys. Yeah, thanks. Have a
Thank
good day.
you.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.